to show the world that not everybody, not every Nazi was totally terrible.
Mm-hmm.
There's good in everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And people helped her who knew nothing about her except they wanted to help a Jew. Even very, very staunch, high-ranking Nazis. And of course my father. He did protect her. He was totally smitten with her.
What if I told you that the wives of some of history's most infamous Nazi leaders were not innocent bystanders? They weren't just devoted housewives. They were active participants, sharing the same hateful ideology that fueled the horrors of the Third Reich. From betrayal to blind loyalty, these women played a role in the atrocities that shaped the darkest chapter of human history.
All these criminals would be chased, quote, to the utmost ends of the earth and brought to justice. Now, this was to achieve two things. First, to tell any Nazi war criminal, we're on to you. You're not going to get away with what you're doing because we're going to win this war, and then we're going to come and find you, and then we're going to come and bring you to justice.
As the world witnessed the fall of Nazi Germany, the fates of these women took shocking turns, some fleeing, others choosing death. In the aftermath of World War II, when Allied forces began rounding up Nazi war criminals, the focus was not only on the high-ranking officials who led the regime, but also on their families. Among the most complex and controversial figures in the Nazi hierarchy were the wives of these leaders, many of whom had been just as enmeshed in the ideology of the Third Reich as their husbands. The question of what to do with these women, were they innocent bystanders, ignorant housewives, or active collaborators, sparked fierce debate. Most of these women claimed innocence, presenting themselves as devoted wives and mothers, but the truth was far more complicated and sinister. One of the most notable figures in this regard was Ger Borman, the wife of Martin Borman, one of Hitler's closest allies and the personal secretary of the Führer. Ger was not just a passive observer of the regime. She was deeply involved in the Nazi Party's ideology. Born in 1909 in Constance, Germany, Ger grew up in a family that strongly supported the Nazi movement. It was her father, Walter Boo, who introduced her to Adolf Hitler, and it seemed that Ger's devotion to the cause exceeded even that of her father. From a young age, she embraced the ideals of National Socialism, making her a true believer in the party's vision. In 1929, Ger married Martin Borman, who had joined the Nazi Party just a few years earlier. Although Martin was not an early member of the movement, he quickly rose through the ranks. Initially, he served as a press officer in his local area before joining the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. It was during this time that he came into contact with Ger's father, and their relationship blossomed. Martin and Ger married shortly thereafter, and the couple would go on to have 9 children together. As Martin's career flourished under Hitler, Ger's role as a wife was closely tied to the rising power of the Nazi regime. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, Martin became chief of staff for Rudolf Hess and later moved into the position of personal secretary to Adolf Hitler, the pinnacle of his career. Ger could not have been prouder of her husband's accomplishments, and she relished the luxuries that came with their newfound status. She took on the role of a dedicated mother, raising their large family in accordance with the ideals of the Nazi state. The couple's 9 children were seen as a testament to their commitment to the German people and the party's vision for the future. However, as the war turned against Germany and the Allies closed in on Berlin in 1945, the Bormans' life of privilege came to an abrupt halt. With the Red Army advancing, Ger and her children were forced to flee. The chaos of the final days of the war provided a veil of confusion that allowed Ger to escape under a false identity, posing as the director of a children's home. 4 of her children were disguised as orphans, and the other 5 were taken by Martin to aid in the escape. Martin, however, saw no way out. Faced with the imminent collapse of the Third Reich, he took his own life, swallowing a cyanide pill. At the time of his death, Allied investigators were unaware that Martin was dead, and Ger's escape was still in motion. She managed to cross the border into Italy, where she was met by a local Nazi official who helped her find a place to hide. They settled in a small village in South Tyrol, far from the reach of the Allies. Despite the apparent safety, Ger was suffering from a medical condition that would soon prove fatal. Once in Italy, Ger sought medical attention for a growing pain in her lower abdomen. A local doctor diagnosed her with advanced ovarian cancer, and it was clear that she would need surgery to survive. As the Allies closed in, Ger was tracked down by 2 British intelligence agents, who informed the British Army of her whereabouts. A British officer arrived at her door, reassuring her that she was not in immediate danger and would not be taken to a concentration camp. Instead, she was sent to a hospital for prisoners of war in the town of Murano, where she underwent surgery. Unfortunately, the operation proved ineffective, and Ger's condition continued to deteriorate. Facing her inevitable death, Ger turned to religion for comfort. She converted to Catholicism in the final months of her life, seeking solace in her newfound faith. Ger died on March 23, 1946, just a few months shy of her 37th birthday. Her death marked the end of the life of one of the most devoted Nazi wives, a woman who had been as entrenched in the ideology of the Third Reich as the men she had married. Ger's tragic fate was a reflection of the larger story of the Nazi wives, many of whom had lived in the shadows of their husbands' crimes, yet were deeply involved in supporting and perpetuating the regime's atrocities. While Ger Borman's life ended quietly, the story of her relationship with Martin and her involvement in the Nazi regime's inner circle was not unique. Many other women, often referred to as the Nazi princesses, had similar roles. They were not simply passive bystanders to the events of the war, they were active participants, either through their support for their husbands or their own direct involvement in Nazi activities. These women were not all loyal housewives, as they often portrayed themselves in the aftermath of the war, but were in many cases deeply involved in the crimes of the Nazi state. Their fates, much like that of Ger Borman, varied. Some found refuge after the war, while others were tried for their crimes or took their own lives. As the war came to a close and the Nuremberg trials began, the question of the wives' complicity in Nazi atrocities continued to divide opinion. Were they simply the innocent wives of powerful men, or were they more deeply involved in the Nazi cause than they cared to admit? This was a question that would haunt historians for years to come, and one that would shed light on the often overlooked role that women played in the Nazi regime. In examining Ger Borman's life, it becomes clear that many of these women were more than just wives and mothers. They were dedicated supporters of the Nazi cause. While some of them may have been ignorant of the full extent of their husbands' actions, others were active collaborators, helping to perpetuate the regime's hateful ideology. The legacy of these women is as complex and tragic as the regime they helped support, and their stories serve as a reminder of the many ways in which the horrors of the Third Reich were made possible. The story of Ger Borman and other Nazi wives offers a glimpse into a dark chapter of history, one that is still not fully understood. Their actions, whether out of loyalty, fear, or conviction, played a significant role in shaping the world of the Nazi Party and its eventual downfall. As we continue to examine the lives of these women, we must remember that the true nature of their complicity is as multifaceted as the regime they helped sustain. One of the most infamous figures in this group was Magda Goebbels, the wife of Joseph Goebbels, one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi propaganda machine. Born Johanna Maria Magdalena Ritschl in 1901, Magda was a product of her time and environment. Raised in Brussels, she spent much of her childhood there before being repatriated to Germany after World War I. In 1921, she married a wealthy German industrialist named Kant, but their marriage ended in 1929, when Kant discovered her infidelity. Despite the end of her marriage, Magda's life would soon take a turn toward the Nazis. In Berlin, Magda was exposed to the growing tensions between the Nazis and their opposition. Encouraged by friends, she attended a large Nazi rally, where Joseph Goebbels, known for his oratory skills and passionate speeches, was the main speaker. Attracted to his charisma and ideas, Magda joined the Nazi Party and quickly rose through the ranks, becoming an influential figure in the women's wing of the party. Her physical beauty and aristocratic background helped her stand out, but it was her fanatical belief in the Nazi ideology that ultimately secured her position in Nazi society. Magda's relationship with Joseph Goebbels evolved quickly. She soon became his lover, and their affair became one of the most famous and toxic unions in the Nazi Party. By 1931, They were making plans for their future, and in December of that year they were married. Hitler himself attended their wedding, acting as the best man. This connection to Hitler was key to their status within the party. Over the next few years, Magda and Joseph would rise to prominence, with Magda becoming a trusted confidant of Hitler and one of his most loyal supporters. Throughout their marriage, Magda bore the strain of having a husband who was deeply involved in the party's actions, both politically and militarily. In 1932, their first child, Helga, was born. However, the birth was a harrowing experience for Magda, who was left physically weak due to complications. Despite her health issues, Magda continued to support her husband's career, even as she suffered from ongoing health problems. When Hitler retreated to his compound during the war, Magda trained as a Red Cross nurse, even though her health remained fragile. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 marked a turning point for Magda and her family. As Soviet troops advanced on Berlin, Magda and Joseph sought refuge in the Führer bunker, the underground hideout where Hitler and his closest allies had taken shelter. The final days in Berlin were marked by fear and uncertainty as the Allied forces closed in. On April 30, 1945, after meeting with Hitler and Eva Braun for the last time, Magda and Joseph Goebbels retreated to their bunker. The next morning, Magda and Joseph carried out a horrific plan to end their lives. They first killed their 6 children by injecting them with morphine and cyanide before taking their own lives. They were later found by Soviet troops, who identified their bodies in the aftermath of the war. While Magda's death marked the end of her life, it was also a symbol of the tragic fate of many Nazi wives. Despite the role they had played in supporting and perpetuating the Nazi ideology, some of these women would not escape the consequences of their husbands' actions. One such woman was Ilse Prut, a figure whose life became entangled with that of one of the most enigmatic and controversial members of the Nazi Party, Rudolf Hess. Born into a wealthy family, Ilse met Hess in the early 1920s, and despite their differences, they formed a close bond. Their relationship, however, was one of spiritual connection rather than physical attraction, as Hess showed little interest in sex. Ilse, though frustrated by this, continued to support Hess's career and the rise of the Nazi Party. In 1927, after Hess's release from prison, Ilse and Hess were married. Their son was born in 1937, and by then, Hess had risen to a position of considerable power within the Nazi hierarchy. However, as the war progressed, Hess's mental health began to deteriorate, and in 1941, he flew solo to Scotland in an attempt to negotiate a peace treaty with the British government. This attempt failed, and Hess was captured, imprisoned, and eventually sentenced to life in prison. Ilse's life after his arrest was marked by solitude and a deep sense of loyalty to her husband's beliefs. Despite the war's end, she continued to support Nazi causes, even publishing books that defended her husband and his actions. She lived the remainder of her life in relative obscurity, but her unwavering loyalty to the Nazi regime made her a controversial figure in the post-war years. Margaret Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler, another key figure in the Nazi Party, also found herself in a difficult position after the war. Margaret had met Heinrich during a train journey in 1925, and the two soon became inseparable. Margaret came from a comfortable landowning family and had a background in nursing. After marrying Himmler, she supported his rise to power, even as he became one of the most notorious figures in the Nazi regime, responsible for overseeing the extermination of millions of Jews. Margaret, like many other wives, found herself caught between loyalty to her husband and the growing awareness of the atrocities being committed. As the war came to an end, Himmler was captured by the Allies and died by suicide in 1945. Margaret was left to face the consequences of her association with Himmler and his crimes. After her husband's death, she was arrested and interrogated, but was ultimately released in 1946. She lived the remainder of her life in relative obscurity, though she was involved in several trials related to her husband's actions. Despite the overwhelming evidence of Himmler's complicity in the Holocaust, Margaret maintained her innocence, claiming that she had been unaware of the full extent of her husband's crimes. This was a claim echoed by many wives of high-ranking Nazis, who insisted that they were simply unaware of the atrocity being committed by their husbands. Hedwig Potust, Heinrich Himmler's secretary and mistress, was another figure who faced scrutiny after the war. Hedwig was a young woman who had been recruited by the Gestapo's press department in 19. She quickly became involved with Himmler, and the two began an affair that would last for several years. Hedwig's life during the war was marked by her close relationship with Himmler, but after the war, she was arrested and interrogated by the Allies. She maintained her innocence, claiming that she had not known about the full extent of the war crimes being carried out by the Nazi regime. Hedwig's post-war life was spent in relative obscurity, much like Margaret Himmler, as she continued to live in silence about the true nature of her involvement with the Nazi regime. The legacy of these women, like the legacy of the men they were married to, is complex and often difficult to unravel. While some were active participants in the atrocities of the Nazi regime, others were less directly involved but still complicit in their own ways. Whether through their unwavering loyalty to their husbands, their support for Nazi ideology, or their willful ignorance of the crimes being committed, these women were deeply intertwined with one of the darkest chapters in human history. In the aftermath of the war, some of these women, like Magda Goebbels and Eva Braun, took their own lives as a means of escaping the consequences of their actions. Others, like Ilse Prue and Margaret Himmler, lived on, maintaining their loyalty to the Nazi cause and the men they had supported. Their stories serve as a reminder that the impact of the Nazi regime extended far beyond the men who held power, affecting the lives of their families, and in many cases, perpetuating the ideology that had led to the death and destruction of millions. As the war ended and the Allies gained control over Germany, the aftermath of Nazi rule left a complex legacy, particularly for the women who had been close to the top ranks of the Nazi Party. While many of the high-ranking Nazi officials faced the consequences of their actions, their wives, mistresses, and daughters were often left to grapple with their own roles in the regime's criminal activities. Some of these women, despite their intimate relationships with the perpetrators of horrific crimes, managed to evade significant punishment, while others faced the full weight of their association with the Nazis. Lena von Osten, later Lena Heydrich, was one of the most vocal and unapologetic supporters of Nazi ideology. Born into a wealthy family in the early 1900s, Lena became a committed Nazi after being introduced to the party by her brother. She was particularly attracted to the party's youth-driven movement and its message of racial superiority. Her fervent anti-Semitism and admiration for Hitler's vision set the stage for her meeting with Reinhard Heydrich, a rising star in the SS and the architect behind the infamous Final Solution. Their relationship began in 1930, and by the following year, they were married. Lena's devotion to both her husband and the Nazi cause was unwavering. She actively participated in the Nazi Party, embracing its ideals and working within the party structure. Reinhard Heydrich, known as the Butcher of Prague, was notorious for his brutal tactics and role in orchestrating the Holocaust. Lena, while enjoying the privileges of her husband's high position, was equally dedicated to the ideals of racial purity and Aryan supremacy. After the war, Lena's connection to Reinhard made her a key figure of interest for the Allies, though they were unable to charge her with any crimes. Despite her active involvement in Nazi activity, Lena was never convicted of any wrongdoing. After Reinhard's assassination in 1942, Lena's life took a different turn. She was interrogated by the Allies, but no charges were brought against her. She later pursued a quieter life, and even remarried in 1965, though she continued to defend her late husband's actions in public. Her post-war years were marked by a series of legal battles in Germany, where she sought to claim a pension due to Reinhard's status as a German police general. In her later years, she became a vocal defender of her husband's legacy, publishing several books and newspaper articles that attempted to vindicate him. In stark contrast to Lena Heydrich's outspoken nature, Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, embodied the image of an innocent, angelic figure in the eyes of many who encountered her. Known for her striking blonde hair and delicate features, Gudrun was seen as the epitome of the ideal child. Her father, Heinrich Himmler, was one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, responsible for overseeing the SS and the extermination of millions of Jews. But Gudrun's own involvement in Nazi activities was minimal, at least on the surface. As the war ended and Allied forces advanced, Gudrun and her mother Margaret were captured and sent to an internment camp. They were interrogated but, like many other women in this position, claimed no knowledge of the atrocities their family members had committed. After being released, Gudrun's life took a decidedly different path from her mother's. While Margaret went into seclusion, Gudrun found herself drawn to far-right causes and far-right politics. She became deeply involved in neo-Nazi activities, working tirelessly for organizations that supported former SS members and promoting their legacy. In 1958, Gudrun attended a gathering of SS veterans in Austria, where she was hailed as the guest of honor. Over the years, she became a vocal supporter of the Nazi cause, advocating for the ideology that had been responsible for the deaths of millions. In the 1960s, she even worked under a false name for West Germany's Bureau of Intelligence. Her role in the neo-Nazi movement was not hidden, and she became increasingly involved in far-right circles, reinforcing the idea that the legacy of the Nazi regime lived on in these women, long after the war had ended. Gudrun's life demonstrated the complex relationship many of the Nazi wives, daughters, and mistresses had with the ideology that had shaped their world. While some, like Gudrun, became active defenders of Nazi principles, others, like Hedwig Hensel, the wife of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, lived in relative obscurity, claiming ignorance of their husband's actions. Hedwig, a quiet and reserved woman, lived in close proximity to one of the most infamous death camps in history, but maintained that she knew nothing about the atrocities taking place next door. Whether this was true or not is a matter of debate, but her role, like that of many others, remained shrouded in ambiguity. Hedwig's post-war life was marked by her arrest and interrogation, but she was never charged with any crimes. She continued to live in relative obscurity, eventually passing away in 1989. Her case is a poignant reminder of how the wives and families of high-ranking Nazis often managed to evade accountability. In the case of other women, such as Magda Goebbels, who took her own life in the final days of the war, their fates were sealed by their unwavering loyalty to the Nazi cause.